Okay. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for being here today. This is really exciting. We've been talking about MTSS implementation in districts mainly focused on elementary, but now we have the opportunity to really learn more about implementing in secondary schools. We're really fortunate to have Jenny Scala here with us. She's going to be leading us through these monthly webinars and really guiding our implementation practice. She indicated to me that there's going to be a lot of participation, so please be prepared for that. I'm sure she's going to cue you when you need to give input on what we're doing. Also, I am going to mute everyone until you have something to say, just to keep background noise to a minimum. We are recording this webinar, and I'm going to post it on the state site for people to view again. So with that, Jenny, go ahead.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. So just a little bit about myself before I get going. I'm a senior researcher at the American Institute for Research. And one of the reasons and a little bit of my brief past about how I got into this work in terms of really looking at peer interventions at the secondary school is I was a technical assistance provider on the National High School Center, which is a federally funded center, along with being a technical assistance provider on the National Center on Response to Intervention. And I was able to really focus my work there predominantly on secondary school implementation and helping some states think about how to support implementation of response to intervention in secondary schools. And so through both of those federally funded centers, I contributed to a couple of publications and a lot of webinars that were all geared on secondary school implementation of tiered interventions. And from there, I started to do a fair amount of work in dropout prevention, early warning system work. And so there's been a nice trajectory for me in terms of really focusing on supporting secondary schools, predominantly high schools, but have been recently working with a few middle schools as well and supporting some of their work that they're doing. Less on tiered interventions, but more in terms of supporting just middle schools in general. So that's how I came, or that's how I got to this point. And I am currently on another federally funded center that's called the College Career Readiness and Success Center. And as the name of the center describes, it's really geared at making sure that students are ready for post-secondary school success, whether that's college or career, whatever that may be. But we also recognize that we can't get to the post-secondary school success if we still have students that we know are struggling in middle and high schools and we're not supporting them effectively. And so when this opportunity came up, I thought it would be a great way of kind of combining resources and being able to provide this webinar series to you today. So I do want to just start with an overview of our session. As Bart indicated, this is going to be a fairly interactive session, and I'll give you a couple of cues about what that's going to look like throughout. But what I wanted to do is to provide, first of all, an overview of what multi-tiered systems of support are, so MTSS, what those can be, what their purposes are, and then get into some of the core components of MTSS, knowing that that's really how some of the implementation gets supported, and then talk about some of the other factors that support implementation, knowing that really today I wanted to start the foundation of the conversation and really gather feedback from you all on potential topics for the rest of the series. There's lots of different places of ways that we could go with this, and I want it to be something that's of interest for you all. And so I really hope that throughout our session today that we can have those opportunities to say, hey, that sounds interesting. I'd like to learn more about that. And I don't want to make any assumptions, but are people familiar with the platform that we're using? And if you are, why don't you just take the opportunity to type into the chat box that yes, you are familiar and are familiar with the platform. If you want a brief reminder of the platform, just type in reminder. If you're not at all familiar, just type in not familiar. And that way we'll just see how people feel about today's platform. Excellent. Great. All right. So looks like people are comfortable with the platform, which is fantastic. So FAQ, anytime that there's a slide that has the light blue surrounding introductions, the way that that header is, the way that introductions are shaded in light blue, that's the giveaway that I'm going to have opportunities for us to talk rather than me just presenting. So I wanted to first of all get to know who's on the call today. So if you don't mind just sharing with the group, you may already know each other, I'm not sure. But if you don't mind just first of all sharing your name, your work role, and your location. And then because it's the day after Halloween, I would love to know what the most creative Halloween costume that you saw this year, what it was. So who would like to start?
Okay, I'm Rick O'Driscoll. I'm an instructional coach, Evanston, Wyoming. Let's see, the most creative costume was tape-faced.
Was tape face? Is that what you said?
Yeah, did you watch America's Greatest, what is it called?
America's Got Talent.
America's Got Talent.
No.
Did you ever watch? So tape-face was a guy, he had a piece of tape across his mouth. All his communication had to be nonverbal, so.
Oh, how funny. That's great.
My name's Doug Rigby. I'm Assistant Superintendent for 612 Schools, also in Evanston. And I was traveling on Halloween night, so I did not see any Halloween costumes.
All right, fair enough. I was also traveling, which is why I'm asking for everybody else's most creative. Okay. Thank you for joining us. Who else is on?
This is Chad Hamilton. I don't know, can you hear me?
Yes, hi Chad.
Hi. So I'm here with a couple of my staff members, and we're at Horizon High School, and we're hoping maybe just to get a kind of an overview of MTSS and then further discuss how that applies to our school. But I guess Horizon's over here in Evanston, and the most creative one that I saw so far this year is, I'm not sure, I think we had a student that was dressed up like Edward Snowden.
Very good. Very creative. Who'd like to go next?
This is Scott Bullock with the Wyoming Department of Education. I work mostly with Title I schools and improvement, helping out with some of the other MTSS initiatives around the state, and used to be a secondary mathematics and technology instructor, so I'm curious about this particular webinar series. As for Halloween, we had a student come across the floor dressed up as a train car, kind of a cardboard creation, but had a lot of detail, and it's pretty an intricate costume. It's pretty cool.
That's great. Thank you, Scott. Who's next? I thought we had a few more people that were logged in. Or is that everyone?
Yes, we did have one write-in, Susan from Park 6 in Cody. She's a special education instructional facilitator. She just wanted to say hello, and she's traveling, or she was traveling on Halloween, so she didn't have a costume to tell us about.
All right. Well, it seems like there were a lot of us that were traveling over the holiday, and it looks like okay, great. All right, so and Ani wrote into her audio isn't working, so she's just going to type in the chat. She's an instructional facilitator in Lander. All right. So, getting right into it. So I wanted to really talk about what multi-tiered systems and supports are. So this is a way of helping to organize building resources, so not just for students, which we usually think about, so addressing students' needs, but also looking at groups of students as well, so helping us leverage some of our resources, looking at bands and groups of students. It also is a way of integrating assessment and providing a continuum of instruction. And data is a key aspect of this. And it's also a prevention framework that has the multiple intervention tiers, so what I affectionately call the ubiquitous triangle and pyramid, that I joked several years ago that I thought that I should get a tattoo of. So that people, when they ask me what the triangle was, I could just show it on the back of my hand, but I never did that. So I am making an assumption that everyone is fairly familiar with that triangle. If that's not the case, let me know and we can talk about that. And then this notion of timely, and the notion of timely interventions for students who are at risk for poorer learning outcomes is a key aspect. We want to make sure that students are getting their support at a timely manner, which sometimes goes against some of the structures that we have in secondary schools, particularly in high schools. And so we have to navigate around that. So some of the two most kind of common examples of multi-tiered system of support are RTI, response to intervention, and PBIS, positive behavior interventions and supports. So those are kind of, it is that notion of it's a prevention framework. But RTI is focusing on academics, PBIS focuses on behavior. They are the same, they have the same core components. So the core components are the same, it's just a different focus in a way. And it doesn't really matter how people get into it, if they're coming at it from first being an RTI district or if they're a PBIS area and people have really focused on behavior. It really doesn't matter, or if it's focused on graduation rates. It doesn't really matter how it starts, but those core components end up being the same. So, are there any questions that's like a brief kind of, okay, it's a prevention framework. So, to get a little bit more into this, I decided rather than me going through everything, we play a little game of a modified version of true or false. So we have two headings. MTSS is something or is not something. And I'm going to read the sentence, and then we're going to do a little bit of guesswork about which one we think it is, and then we'll see what appears up on the side. So, is MTSS for all students, including those needing enrichment?
Yes.
You can type it in if you want to the chat box.
We say true.
Okay, true. Well done. Is it a single program or curriculum?
Is it a curriculum? No.
No.
I heard a no. Is that correct?
Yes, false.
All right. Is this pretty good for people?
Absolutely.
Okay. So is it flexible for schools and districts to customize to meet their unique circumstances? Okay, I'm going to give everyone that one. Yes, it is. Is it just for students who are struggling or students with disabilities?
No, it is not.
Excellent. And this is what I'm going to say for secondary schools. That is often a a myth that has to get debunked in terms of having people really understand that it's not just for struggling students, that it's for all students. Is it, well, I'm going to say it's not a one-size-fits-all prescriptive model. Is it data-informed and evidence-based?
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, it is. And how about, is it a collaborative process that incorporates a team-based approach?
Yes.
Yep. And then the last two I'm just going to pull up. These are the no's. So it's not the responsibility of one teacher or specialist. It's also something that's really important, particularly when you get to grades where students are really rotating through a lot of different teachers. And that final one of the, it is not a pre-referral process. So these are some easy things that we start off in terms of just helping clarify what MTSS is and what it is not for people. So my question for you all then, moving into this is, I looked for this on the website and I couldn't find it, but I didn't look for a really long time, so I probably just missed it. How is MTSS currently described or defined in Wyoming? Is it defined in Wyoming? Is that a district decision? Is there a state definition?
You know, it's currently really district driven at this point. And then districts are also determining their needs and how they're going to implement.
All right, so then how is it defined in some of your districts that you're in or that you're working with?
This is Shad Hamilton over at Horizon, and I've worked with a few different school districts. Not so much here at Horizon and Evanston. I think we have probably one of the better MTSS systems underway that I've seen. But I think in other districts I've worked with and been in, it's all too often used as a pre-referral process for special ed. That's how staff interpret it, and that's kind of how the system's worked on, I guess.
So how would you say it is in Evanston, there where you are?
Well, I'm new here. This is my first year here. Scott probably knows that. But from what I've seen so far, I mean, I worked with Bart, another school district, to help build a system. I think that they're probably, I've just been in a couple different meetings at the district level, and I think the process is further underway as far as getting staff to understand that really MTS is a collection of all of your systems, that intervention isn't just the only component of MTSS, that's a collection of all your academic systems and programs kind of compiled into that pyramid, that you're using data to identify students for the appropriate levels of that pyramid. What part of the system are they in, kind of deal. So I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
You know, I think Jenny, Shad said it well. Really, MTSS is just a framework that we're using to meet student need. We base our decisions on data. We choose interventions that are evidence-based. We monitor the effectiveness of those interventions, whether a student is struggling or doing well and needs enrichment. It's really a way for us to meet the needs of all students.
What about from some of the people that are from a different area? or a different region? Or Scott, from your perspective at the state education agency, how have you seen different districts implement tiered intervention?
Sorry about that. I had two mute buttons. I had my phone muted and also the PC. A lot of it, through the transition year, this is kind of a new venue for me. But just through a lot of my aspect of it is through the comprehensive school improvement plans, and it's kind of a limited view. So I'm seeing, kind of like always, hopefully not always, but I see a lot of emphasis on the tier 2 and the tier 3. Mostly it's on the RTI, the academic side, as opposed to the behavior in the PBIS. But I see maybe the misconception that MTSS is all about, completely about the interventions that are happening, as opposed to kind of that core, the universal or the tier 1 side of it. But again, for my active roles, I just haven't seen enough of the exposure, and hopefully through the transition year can kind of fix that.
Yeah, I would say that what you just described, Scott, is pretty common, and particularly in secondary schools. That notion of skipping over tier 1 and jumping into tier 2 and tier 3 is not uncommon. And I think people first gravitate towards the academic focus as well. It often can be a little bit easier to see the need and to get the data and the use of data in that area in particular. So that makes sense. So all right, so we've talked a little bit about where MTSS is in your current area, your role that you're coming to the SAT. So let's dig into some of the key components. So you guys have mentioned many of these. So this notion of the research-driven practices. So this isn't just about academics, it's just not about behavior either. I would say at the secondary level, it can include attendance, it can include lots of different areas of focus, and that's really going to be really driven by your data. That's number 5. So first, we want to make sure that we're using research-driven practices. The second core component is having a screener. We need to have some sort of way of determining which students are at risk for whatever the outcome is that we are interested in. And I'm going to go through each of these in more depth later on. Progress monitoring. We want to make sure that students are making progress towards the goal and getting back on track. That intensity and that continuum of tiers, that's what that 4th one is, the pyramid. That's where that comes into play. And this really where I think so much of the work actually comes down to is this use of data and usable data, and using data to inform decisions across the continuum of the framework. And that includes, from my perspective as well, not just at the school level, but also the district level. There's a key role that districts can play in supporting the implementation. So these are 4 components that have been kind of identified through a number of different federally funded centers, the Center on Response and Intervention being one of them. The PBIS Center would agree with these core components as well. And most of those different those different centers really started in this work focusing first at the elementary school. And through a collaboration with the National High School Center, the National Center on Instruction, and the National Center on Response and Intervention, those 3 federally funded centers, we got together and said, look, we're getting questions about what does it mean to implement tiered interventions in secondary schools. We know people have really been focused at elementary, but we want to talk and look at what people are saying and what the implications are for implementing MTSS in secondary schools. We know that they are the same core components as what we have at the elementary school. That stays the same. However was too long of a word, so we stuck with but for the slide. there are different considerations for the infrastructure and implementation. And that is really, really critical. To get to some of those two things, there's information that we've put out in a couple of different publications that I'm going to highlight towards the end of our time today, that gets into that in more depth about what those kind of contextual factors are. Another big aspect that we have to deal with and grapple with is that we have a smaller number of research-based assessments and interventions. So how do we appropriately identify which students are at risk? Appropriately meaning valid and reliable measures. And then how do we know that once we've identified those students, that we have interventions that research has proven that for our population, our student population, gets students back on track and takes care, like it alleviates, we take care of that. And we can remove that intervention, right? So we provide that intervention, we no longer need it, particularly for Tier 2. We don't have a lot of research base to tell us what interventions are successful, and it's growing. There are a lot of people that are doing a lot of research that's coming out, but for a lot of things we just don't know, which is hard because every day we have students coming to school. So trying to figure out what we want to do with it. So we're at a disadvantage there in terms of the secondary level. And one of the things that I really talk about is in the secondary level, the focus may be different. So maybe your focus is all on attendance. That's okay, as long as it's driven by your own data. And so I often get the question of, can you give me a recommendation to go see another high school or another middle school somewhere in the country that's doing MTSS well? And the short answer is that there isn't a short answer. I end up having a lengthy conversation. So what your data suggests you need to be looking at? Because you don't want to pass off a reference to a place that might be focusing on behavior if you're really aware and your data are showing you that you need to focus on literacy across the country. So there's a lot of different ways that data really, really comes into this. And so how MTSS looks in one school might end up looking very different to a school that's across the state or somewhere down the road, but we have that. And so, I'm going to hold off to that a little bit. So one of the things that I've actually seen a lot of recently is, particularly for high schools, that their MTSS is focusing on improving graduation rates or decreasing dropout rates. That's where their data are, and that's where particularly as Bart described MTSS as this framework I wrote it down because it was it's this framework for meeting student needs. So if you think about high schools, their goal is to make sure that students are graduating. And so to make sure that students are graduating, some high schools are focusing on improving graduation rates. What also connects is, so if we don't have a lot of research at the high school level, there's something of a mismatch of, okay, so what should we be doing if we don't have a lot of that research? And so one of the things that we did is we went through and kind of cast a wider net with high schools and kind of kept in mind that notion of graduation, which got us to some of the dropout prevention research. And so in 2008, the Institute of Education Sciences published a practice guide that was focused on dropout prevention. And they were just focused on high schools. There should be an updated guide coming out within the next year that will also, I think, include middle schools. It will potentially include middle schools. And so in this practice guide, what they did is they looked through all of the most rigorous research for dropout prevention, and looking through all of that, looking at the findings, they were able to come up with 6 recommendations for thinking about how to go about improving and really focusing on dropout prevention in high schools. So this first aspect is what they call a diagnostic. So using data systems that identify individual students at high risk of dropping out, okay. Then there's that middle section that's in the targeted interventions, assigning adult advocates, providing academic support and enrichment, implementing programs to improve students' behavior. Okay, sounds pretty familiar. And then there's the school-wide intervention section that they said that needed to be addressed as well, personalizing the learning environment and providing rigorous and relevant instruction. So if you think about those 6 bullets, they have it under diagnostic, targeted, and school-wide intervention, and you map those straight on to our core components, key components of MTSS, you'll see that the diagnostic really lines up quite nicely with screening. We have to have some way of identifying students at risk of dropping out of high school. And the tiered framework aspect gets into the targeted interventions, the school-wide interventions. What wasn't listed explicitly in their practice guide are these other core components that we know we need in terms of using data and monitoring progress. And we don't have that as much to percolate out of this practice guide. But so one of the things that I found really helpful in thinking about implementation in secondary schools and trying to, get through and break up that misconception of multi-tiered systems of support as a pre-referral process is being able to ground it in this research on dropout prevention, which almost everyone in a secondary school can really understand. It lines up quite easily. And so it's another way of addressing and getting into the conversation with schools, in secondary schools in particular, that might be just a little bit easier. And that's one of the biggest factors that I found with the secondary schools. It applies to every school in general and elementary definitely as well. But it's a little bit more present in secondary schools is this notion of kind of making sure that people can see how it applies to them at their level. And so when you talk about things in a way where you're framing it to support graduation and to reduce dropouts, and to strengthen your dropout prevention programs. And the programs, when I say programs, it's really a system. It's a framework. It's not a particular curriculum package that we're talking about. So all of these things lend themselves quite nicely when you're talking to multi-tiered systems of support. And I bring that up because, again, it's just, I think, an easier way it could be another way to have the conversation. And sometimes that's all that needs to happen. So I had a time here where I was hoping that we could have some conversation. So let's just take this first bullet. So are there ways that you see connections between MTSS and current work that might be going on in your secondary school? You can type it in, you can jump in. I need a drink of water, so I'm going to be quiet for a little bit.
I think at Evanston High School, for example, I think although it's not being, called MTSS, the work that's being done around reducing both the number of absences for students, particularly those students that are missing 10 or more days per semester or per school year, depending on the course and how that's set up, as well as goals around reducing the number of Tier 3 behavior students, those students that are consistently receiving discipline referrals.
Great. Thank you for sharing. How about others?
Okay, I'll share one that is related to the PDSA work we're doing with our content teams. So one of them is working on increasing the number of assignments turned in on time. So they're working on a process to identify kids who are turning in assignments late, and then periodically, monitor them and see what we can do to increase the number, decrease the number of assignments not turned in on time, with the hopes that the more assignments turned in on time, the greater the achievement will be. And we'll use our data within the NWEA and to check that.
Absolutely. Anybody else want to share? So we'll dig into some of, or each of the core components next. So starting off with screening. If you think about screening in a kind of classic response to intervention framework, it is a way of identifying students who are at risk for poor learning outcomes. We broaden it for MTSS, so it's not just about learning. It's about, could be behavior, could be attendance, could be graduation, could be learning as well. But you have to have some way of identifying which students are at risk for your outcome, for your focus, whatever that is. It's also a way of identifying students who need additional assessment, for instance, progress monitoring and instruction or support, and that gets into those interventions. Screening also gives us data on the effectiveness of our core instruction, curriculum, and school-wide supports. That should be valid and reliable. So the valid and reliable can be something of a point in pause for us at the high school level for sure. We just don't have a lot of valid and reliable screeners out there. I'm going to talk about a couple of them. In terms of that second to last bullet of the providing data on the effectiveness of the core instruction, I've worked with schools and staff people all over the nation, and one of the questions that I would get a lot of times is when I was starting to explain the pyramid to people who had never been introduced to it before, and have them kind of do their own pyramid about after talking through the different levels, having them think about, without looking at any of their data, because it was just a brief workshop, where they think their schools would be. It wasn't uncommon for it to be upside down or not quite a pyramid and more of like a diamond. And all of that gives you the idea that means that your tier one isn't sufficiently serving your student population. And so that's a way of really thinking about using your screener and your data from your screener to just kind of give you that overall health of the effectiveness of your tier one, which I really like to think about because oftentimes people think over that. So one of the things I did want to spend a little bit of time on, because it's getting a lot of buzz in a lot of different places, is our early warning systems. And so what early warning systems are is that they use indicators. They're called early warning indicators, most commonly considered attendance, behavior, and course performance. So the ABCs is generally what they're called. And those are used to identify which students are at risk of dropping out of high school. One of the things that's helpful about using early warning indicators is that we have some baseline research that's been done nationally that gives us an approximate threshold for attendance, behavior, and course performance, so that we actually now have something that's reliable and valid and as a way to identify which students are at risk, which has been one of the issues for high schools of not having a way of doing a screener. There's also data and research that's been done on early warning indicators going down into the middle school levels using the same attendance, behavior, and course performance. The thresholds, or when a student is identified as being at risk, is different between middle and high school. But again, it gives us another way of getting an idea about how students are doing and if students are off track or on track for high school graduation. There's some pieces that are coming out in the near future that say, okay, well, there's been some research recently that says, while it's great that we have these national research and national indicators with those thresholds, not sure that it actually takes into account my local context. And so there are some pieces that are coming out in the near future that if districts have a pretty data-savvy person on staff that can help them walk through their own data and to determine, based off of their own data, where indicators and where those thresholds could be set to be able to incorporate local data. Wouldn't recommend that people do that until they've been using the national thresholds for a few years, or if they have a really savvy person that knows that that having that local context is important to begin. But otherwise, I would start with the national thresholds that have been used across the nation. It's a screener. You look at it after different grading periods, whenever your grading periods are. You also look at it after the first attendance collection, either 20 or 30-day count, depending on which you have in your district. And you can identify which students are off track. And then you can start to dig deeper and do that monitoring, provide those interventions, continue that monitoring of student progress, and use data to kind of continually work through the cycle. So that's one screener that we know of that has been used across different places. So are you guys currently doing screeners, and if so, what screeners are you using in your schools? Or if you're not using a screener, are you aware of anybody that's using early warning systems as a way of identifying students who might be needing support in a multi-tiered system?
Hello, this is Shad. So it's kind of interesting since we're an alternative school, listening to this, because a lot of the students that we get are, in effect, I think partially they've been screened in some way as part of their enrolling in our school. And it's usually attendance, behavior, and academic indicators are all indicators. I think at a district level, we have some components in place that are looking at 7-12 junior high school attendance kind of issues and interventions. And I think, I can look at that data and probably, since we have both junior high and high school students here, I can kind of see, okay, this is an issue. This is probably going to be a student here. As far as looking at an alt school level, it becomes a little bit more complicated for me to answer, because they've already been. Is any of that making sense to you?
Yeah, it is. I mean, and I think that's where so you in your district might have already applied, maybe not, not calling it early warning indicators, but you basically applied them attendance, behavior, course performance to identify who would be a student at your alternative high school in your program. And then I would say within your alternative programming, are there still screeners that you would look at for, say, attendance or even behavior? So, you've got your students that you've got that are there, and so then how do you decide which students might need a little bit more work? How do you check if your whole tier 1 instruction is healthy?
Yeah, I think attendance is an easy one. I mean, that's something you can systematically look at every X number of days. I mean, like every 3 days, every 5 days, 10 days, letters go out, you start calling. There's a process in place for that. Academically, grades, course completions, letter grades, and course progress is another indicator that you can look at weekly that we do. And based on that feedback, are there candidates for after school, for Saturday school, or for extra tutoring, that kind of stuff. Behavior, same thing. I think we have a system that tracks that, and you can look at referrals, and start to notice patterns that way and start to intervene. Those are kind of the systems that we use here that I would imagine most high schools have in place.
So can I add something?
Of course.
So as I was thinking about this and thinking about screeners, I've been working at the elementary school for several years and now at secondary. So when I think about screeners at the elementary, I oftentimes think of a quick test that we're giving kids to determine how they're doing. So with what you're saying, I'm thinking about a lot of screeners that we're using. So if we're looking at, and we've been looking at this at our building, is behavior, attendance, work completion, and grades. I kind of think it's almost after the fact, but you're going in maybe weekly and checking attendance, checking behaviors, checking work completion, and checking grades. And then at that time, if that habit continues, we start identifying them as at risk for maybe, failing. One of the things we talked about this morning is looking at the DNF list. How do we look at that weekly and determine, okay, how are we going to help those kids get off of that in order to increase achievement, therefore increase dropout rates later, and so forth. So I'm thinking that this is a lot different than elementary because I've typically thought of it as a test that we give a kid, whereas now it's kind of a different way of gathering data that might already be there that we just need to look at. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that it makes a ton of sense, and I think that's true. Oftentimes in secondary schools, we're not administering another assessment. We're using data that we already have and just looking at it differently, systematically, to figure out which students are at risk. And that becomes important if you think about it from a high school, whether you're on a traditional schedule or a block schedule, you've got so many different teachers throughout the course of a week, whereas in elementary school, there's less of that. And so you want to be able to include all of the different data sources in a way that, it's about, I keep coming back to the phrase of the work smarter, not harder. And so we already have this data, and that's where I think a lot of the power has come out with the early warning indicators is this readily available data that schools already have, and then we're able to look at it and say, oh, look, now we have a valid and reliable way of identifying who's not on track for graduation. And that's the power that we haven't necessarily had at the secondary level, whereas the elementary level could, for whatever you think about DIBELS could be a great way of identifying which students needed additional support. And there are a lot of different screeners in elementary school for a lot of different aspects, like whether you're talking about phonics, whether you're talking about reading comprehension, some of them combine them. There's just a lot more resources that has been researched in elementary school compared to what we have at secondary schools. So I think you're spot on in the notion of you don't have to do another assessment. It's not always an assessment. And in fact, most times it's not in secondary schools. It's trying to figure out, what makes the most sense. And with the kind of DNF report, so is that the screener or is that the progress monitor in terms of doing that on a weekly basis? That's kind of semantics, but I point that out because you also want to figure out a system and a process that's efficient on both meeting the student ends as well as meeting the realistic finite time and resource that staff have. And so that's something to also think about. I would say that checking for grades on a quarterly basis probably isn't sufficient enough, but reviewing the list on a quarterly basis is the same as a benchmark, right? We talk about doing some ways of having benchmarked and looking at benchmark quarterly data for kind of how are students doing. We often know when you walk into a staff in any school and say which students are the ones that are most worrisome, that you're most worried about not meeting the outcomes, whatever outcome you're focused on, people are going to be able to give you the students who are chronically absent, who really, really struggle and are multiple grade years behind, or maybe even just a few grade years behind. But it's those students that might be a little bit more in the middle that aren't absent all that frequently, but they're absent enough. It's just spread out over time that it puts them at risk. Or they're sick once for a couple of weeks. So I think that's the aspect of these screeners that you want to figure out what's the right balance, and that's where having reliable and valid kind of data points is really, really helpful. Does that help? Any other thoughts of other screeners that you might already be using? All right, we're going to move on to the tiered interventions. So one of the things that we always like to point out is that the interventions need to be aligned to your focus area. Sounds pretty obvious, but I've been in a lot of schools where they say, we're focused on behaviors, and I actually have them work through this process of cataloging all of their available interventions, and then they notice that in that cataloging process, also figuring out how many students they can accurately kind of support in terms of that notion of supply and demand. So if only 5 students could be supported in their behaviors if they had interventions that they had, but they had 15 academic interventions, but they said that school-wide they were focusing on their behavior interventions or behavior, it was something of a mismatch. And so while we say that these interventions need to be aligned, sounds obvious, but going through a cataloging process of just finding out what are the available interventions in a school, in secondary schools, often different people know of different interventions, and there might not be kind of this catalog list that might need to get updated on, an annual basis and maybe even quarterly or twice a year look at it and update it. But it's good to know what interventions exist. And when I say interventions, I'm not talking about kind of curriculum and programs, but there's also different strategies that have been emphasized within a district or school. There's different ways of really thinking about what are interventions. And so going through that process can be really helpful for staff to start to really get a clear understanding of what are the available interventions in the school. We talked about this earlier, Scott brought this up in terms of the notion of secondary schools really seeing the need of Tier 2, Tier 3, but they often skip ensuring Tier 1 is strong. And there could be a lot of different reasons for it. It's not uncommon. So I think that's something that we've found in a lot of places. And I also think there's a piece that we wrote a few years ago, 4 years ago now, where we were talking to 3 different districts in Colorado that were implementing tiered interventions in their high schools. And one of the schools, I think we had talked to them a couple of years earlier, and then we came back a few years later and talked to them. They said, we knew that we needed to focus on Tier 1, but we thought we were when you first came and talked to us. But we jumped into Tier 2, Tier 3. But only now do we get that we need to focus on Tier 1. And the district person was in the room, and the district person just put her head in her hand and started shaking her head and said, we've been talking about all this differentiation for 5 years. And, kind of what could we have done differently? And the staff said, I'm not really sure that you could have done anything differently. We needed to work through our own data to really believe that we needed to do it differently. And if the district, the staff said, we heard it, but it wasn't until we really worked through our own data that we saw we weren't doing a good enough job in Tier 1. And so that's a process, and that process takes a lot of time to get people to really understand and to hone in on that Tier 1 work. The other thing that I also always talk about is establishing exit and entry criteria for interventions for students. So it's often pretty common for us to think about the entry criteria for students, but we're not always explicit about the exit criteria. And that becomes important because we want to make sure that interventions aren't a parking lot or become another way of talking about tracking. I have seen that throughout the country where they just end up tracking students. And they call it different interventions, and there's no way that students will ever catch up and get back on track. But they firmly believe that they were doing tiered intervention work. And so we want to make sure, and one way to alleviate that is to make sure that you have exit criteria for students. So, when they no longer need that Tier 2 support, or maybe some of those extra supports and strategies that are available to all students in Tier 1. So what I did is I came up with some examples of interventions aligned to attendance at the 3 different levels of the universal, targeted, and intensive. So with attendance, there's a lot of different things. There are multiple apps and technology that I've seen used for notifying parents if students are absent. And it's almost like robocalling, but with texting. And so that way there's an immediate understanding and way of letting parents know or family or guardian members know when students are absent, and that just happens for all students. There's positive social incentives for good attendance. We know that that's very, very powerful. And that culture, making sure that the culture is saying that it's really important and attending every day matters to us. And so targeted could be 2 or more unexcused absences in a month, brings on a brief daily text by an adult to that student. Maybe that there is an attendance team that starts to get together and does some problem solving. And in this problem solving, you start to dig deeper into your data and ultimately get to some of that root cause work. And that intensive is going to be the sustained one-on-one attention, and maybe bringing in social services as needed or community support to help students. For behavior, very similar. We know that it's important to have those behavior. I also think that it's important to have students be involved in setting expectations for behavior, coming at it from the PBIS aspect and bringing that into it. If you have advisory periods, having those can help as well in terms of teaching the behavior expectations, having those times for adults to really check in with all of the students so that all students have a sense that they feel that there's an adult that knows them in the building. The targeted can be a simple behavior checklist, a mentor, and then intensive could be an in-depth behavior assessment, and then could get into some of the behavior contacts as well. So for some of the universal things that I also wanted to add that I've seen, I've heard of a lot recently, just this past year, I've heard of a lot of middle schools using Kickboard. I'm not recommending or endorsing any of this, by the way. I'm just giving you what I've heard. And it's almost like that every student gets a bank account. And so rather than doing like the school dollars, that's just an electronic bank account, and money will get added, and then for misbehaviors, the currency will get subtracted as well. And so having a clear understanding of what the expectations are so that students have the same understanding of how much cognitive behavior or special things can get paid into is important. I was talking to a parent recently who was saying that the reward system was clearly going through a growth spurt or an inflationary period, because compared to last year, it was very obvious that teachers were not rewarding in the same way, and that students were starting to get a little troubled by that. And so that's another aspect that's important if you're using that. We've also heard and seen a lot of people using Check and Connect for intensive, maybe targeted, depends on the resources. So that can be that's a program that we've seen, but it has a lot of research base behind it. So that's another one. Of course, performance. This is pretty obvious, and you guys have talked about some of this as well. So using the research-based instructional programs, and I would also add strategies there. The in-classroom support to enable active and engaging pedagogy. And for the universal, this is where I think in secondary schools, it's important for people to understand that when we're talking about different interventions and supporting Tier 1, there are a lot of strategies that teachers can bring to bear in their classroom. It's not another packaged curricula. And that's where people infuse using a curriculum program or packaged curriculum with adding in other supports that will help students be successful where they need it. So that's important. So there could be, for targeted, the elective extra help courses. Do you guys, and this varies not only across states, but within states as well. So do you guys, in your schools, do students have study halls?
Schools, at least in Evanston, do not have study halls anymore, and that's based on the time requirements and graduation requirements. Basically, a study hall does not count in any way, shape, or form towards academic time, and therefore is not something that you can put in every student's schedule without extending your day significantly.
Yep. A lot of sense. And there are some places where people have basically taken their study halls and reorganized that time to be elective periods or enrichment periods, and they'll come up with some name, but basically every student gets assigned to a classroom, whether it's for enrichment or for additional support that's needed. And it's often where some of that targeted support happens. And that's one place where some of that targeted support can happen. And then for the intensive, it could be something such as one-on-one tutoring.
So in terms of, I'd like to hear from Scott more specifically around how will, if schools are starting to do that and starting to look at whether it's advisory time, whether it's flex time, something that's built into the day for student supports, how will the WDE view those types of things in the schedules as districts and schools submit them to the WDE?
I could definitely take that question and try and run with it. Right now, with the knowledge I have, it's just outside of my realm. But I could take a look around the floor and see who would be involved in those type of things and see if I can't get an answer for you.
Right, and my intent is not to pin you down, but I know that it's similar to the study hall area, and I can't quote the statute specifically and how it's tied to the academic day and the number of total hours that are required, but there's very specific expectations for time built into a day. Sure. And so if not, some students would be doing enrichment, some students would be doing remediation and that type of thing. But I don't want to speak for other districts, but we're always very apprehensive about putting things like that into a schedule in fear of how will that be interpreted.
Sure. I know with the calendar and a lot of the, like scheduling and things like that, Diane Fraser gets involved with it and maybe Bill Panel's team. As far as actually like collecting any sort of like high-level data or anything like that, I'm not too sure if we'd have anything that concrete. But from working with, either legislators for the intent or the board for the application of it, they might have some insights that I can glean from them and share with the group.
Excellent. Thank you.
And Ani wrote in that, so they have a student readiness block at their high school, and students are required to go see a teacher if they're struggling in specific standards. 4 days a week and enrichment opportunities for students who don't need the additional support. And then she continues to say that it was part of the transition to block scheduling at the high school. So I'm not exactly sure if that's another resource that needed to be changed, if anything, policy-wise, for that to be recorded appropriately in transcripts, and also making sure that it wasn't hindering or overemphasizing credits as well. So the credit aspect was something that schools had to figure out as well in the process.
I was going to, I'll probably slide my email into the chat box, just so that I can kind of get this properly caught. And it sounds like this is going to be kind of a conversation that might spiral out into a couple different directions. But prior to kind of doing some research around the floor, maybe if I can get a couple of emails so that I can get, specific questions and concerns, I can get those, the answers more appropriate, I guess.
All right, Scott put his email in there. So some of the aspects and some of the common questions that we get around interventions in secondary schools is how to go about scheduling them. So I've hinted at this, but we don't want those interventions to be parking lots for students. So figuring out something where there's the flexibility for students to move around. So the example that Ani put into the chat box, where students have the option of doing enrichment as well, is another way that could be done. So that, again, everybody's getting something. We've also seen if people are using advisory periods. There was a school that I talked to at some point, and just talked to them, so I don't know how strong what they did worked, but their focus was on mathematics because they realized that a lot of their students were struggling with mathematics. So what they did is they changed the advisory grouping. It wasn't quite a true advisory, but it was a modified advisory. And students were assigned to advisory teachers that were mathematics teachers if they were in need of support, extra support in mathematics. And then the math department actually put out a weekly kind of problem of the week, math problem of the week, and also did a tutorial for the staff that they recorded so that staff could watch the math teachers deliver the lesson and then answer frequently asked questions and provide kind of a cheat sheet for the non-math teachers. And that those were turned into the advisory period, and that data got implemented or kind of fed back to the math department, and they would change the groupings as needed. And that school had a focus on math, and so that's what they did. So they were really thinking creatively, given their schedule, and really figuring out what are the kind of true things that can't be changed, and working within those confines. It's obviously important to make sure that staff understand the process and changes that are happening. It's a no-brainer, but important to point out. And then, so for schools that have traditional 6 to 8 period days, it's a tough decision, but many of the schools that I've talked to will, for Tier 2 students, and thinking of Tier 2 as being a time-bound support, they will often pull students out of electives to meet with teachers. If there is not a study hall or a free period that they can do, they often do reassignments for lunch, if that works out as well. Some of the Tier 1 additional supports that kind of cross between a Tier 1 or a Tier 2 are homework centers. And some schools have made the homework center be a staff assignment so that there's always a math and ELA person assigned to the homeroom or the homework center throughout the day. And then I think they also kept it open after school for a little bit. So some students were assigned to it if they needed additional support for varying lengths of time. But they had a cap of that if a student was coming so often or was assigned at a certain length, then they had to dig deeper because that wasn't addressing the underlying aspect and getting the student caught up. So they used that as a way of getting some of that kind of, it was a cross between a tier 1 or a tier 2 support. Those are a couple that are the more common ones that I've seen in the traditional 6 to 8 period days. The block schedules seen a lot similar to what Ani pointed out that they're doing, where there's a common block where people just get assigned appropriately. I've also seen some of the blocks where they will have in a common block period, they will change, they will group different content teachers in different parts of the school very close together so that students can rotate in and out based off of what they're doing during that block for the intervention / enrichment. So students will just kind of cluster. There's a place that they are assigned to go, but it's kind of that teach to run a little bit where that grouping, those groupings are very flexible and they change as needed. So what that gets to is we think about the schedule in terms of providing time for interventions for students. Just as important is making sure that staff have time for these collaborative data-based decision-making times as well as looking through the data. And that's, we often think about the student side of needing more time for interventions, but we also need to make sure that staff have time to make sense of the data and to make some decisions. I'm going to skip our next discussion on student interventions. We can come back to that later. We'll go into some of the progress monitoring really quickly. So progress monitoring gives us information about students as well as intervention. Both are important. And the information about interventions, the information about students, I think, is pretty obvious. And I think most people think about progress monitoring from a student perspective, and if the student is making, is going to meet the short or long-term goals, and is progress being met at an acceptable rate, or have we become making this into a tracking aspect? For the interventions, I think this second subpoint bullet of the kind of notion, are some interventions being more effective than others? And starting to just get us some of that data that we have to dig deeper then to figure out what's going on. Or are we seeing the progress that we assumed we would see from these different interventions? And so really thinking about what does progress monitoring look like? And that's what I was saying for some of those grades and turning in assignments. Maybe that D and F weekly report is more of a progress monitoring mechanism to kind of check to see how students are doing rather than thinking of it as a screener. It could be both, I understand. But really making sure that you have some way of thinking about, as you figured out your focus, you're starting to think about what your supports are going to be. You have to also then figure out how are you going to monitor progress over time. What does that look like? What do you need to be able to do that? And I think the district can also play a role in this aspect about various interventions and which ones might be more effective than others. So at the secondary level, we see a lot of formal and informal formative assessments that are being used as progress monitoring tools. Perfectly okay. Lots of benchmark assessments, quizzes, grades, attendance, tickets out the door, things like that to make sure that students got the concept that was being taught. Could be a maze passage in the middle school. It could be a time sampling for behavior. It could be office discipline reporting, in general. I will give you guys information at the end in the resources. There was a webinar that we did about 6 years ago that was all on progress monitoring at the high school level, given the fact that we don't necessarily, again, have the same number of progress monitoring tools that we have at the elementary level. So I do want to spend just a few moments here. So thinking about your ways about reviewing formal and informal progress monitoring data. Is it fairly common for staff to do it? Do you have staff time for people to look at data? Talk to me a little bit about your progress monitoring. Is anybody there?
We're here. We're just thinking.
Okay.
So I have something I was just thinking about. So this morning we were talking about reviewing the data, and being as this was kind of our first attempt this morning, was that it was hard to be honest about the data. Does that make sense?
Totally.
That it became an excuse or maybe a reason for things happening without even talking about what could we do to fix it, or what is the data really saying. So is that typical of a first attempt?
Oh goodness, yes. Yep, absolutely common. There are some great protocols, for lack of a better term, that could be used depending on what your data sources are. But a way of having a standard framework of talking about it can alleviate some of that stress as well that teachers often have when they go through that process.
Jenny, are those listed in your resource section or your reference?
No, but I'm writing it down as a potential other additional topic for another webinar.
Okay, awesome. And also, while you're writing things down, will you share those national standards that they've identified for behavior, attendance, and grades?
For the early warning indicators?
Yeah, just so we have some cutoff points for our at-risk.
Yeah, I can list them to you right now off the top of my head, or I can send them to you. Which would you prefer?
You know, why don't you send them? And it may be worth reviewing as well and part of another webinar as well, just so everyone else has those.
Yep. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Okay. Any other quick thoughts on progress monitoring, knowing that it is potentially a very robust conversation to have a whole nother session on as well? Any burning questions that people will be missed if you don't get to bring up if I move us along?
Go for it.
All right. So I'm actually going to skip a lot of this that we can come back and talk about later on. I do want to just highlight a few resources really quickly before I get us into also, I want your input in terms of additional topics, but I also wanted to point out a few things. So the brief that I wrote with a colleague on the systematic approach to implementing RTI in 3 Colorado high schools, that's archived on ERIC, and so the URL is there. The High School Tiered Intervention Initiative is the collaboration between the National High School Center, the National Center in Response to Intervention, and the Center on Instruction. The link that's there goes to not only the PDF that has the kind of findings report, but it also has a template that goes over and highlights, I think, 7 different contextual factors that I would also love to go through as one of our webinar conversations, because it also has some great guiding questions that you can then bring back and use to help your thinking. And that also is the group that had the progress monitoring webinar that's archived as well. And then the Center on Response to Intervention has also done some work around the same time that we're doing the high school tiered intervention. They focused on doing some work specific to middle school, and the contextual factors were really quite the same. The other aspect that came up in the middle school conversation was the transition aspect, because middle school has a transition in and the transition out, and really helping to think about how to support the transition. They came out with a guide as well for parents to talk about RTI in middle schools. They also created a document that has some examples of schedules for middle schools. They were published probably in 2010 or 2011, but it's a resource if you want it. So the last slide that I want to go over tonight are potential topics for future webinars. So scheduling, because I had just gotten an email from Bart asking me about scheduling. I put that one up there. Schedules for staff, not even schedules, maybe even protocols or going about the process of discussing data is another one that's number 2. Next one, early warning systems. I would add in the early warning indicators would be part of that. The 4th one of selecting appropriate interventions, designing tiered interventions, very similar. Determining what interventions are already in use at your school and bringing that back and kind of sharing out what you learned in that process. You do progress monitoring. Anything else? What would be most helpful for you all over the course of this series of webinars?
So, are there identified protocols or processes that schools typically go through to identify where they are in the process? So, for example, number 6, determining what interventions already are in use at your school. I mean, is there a step-by-step or a protocol for a school to go through and say, here are our tier 1 supports, these are our universal things, here's what we're doing or what we think we're doing for tier 2 and possibly for tier 3 students?
So we have, I wouldn't call it a protocol, but we have a template that you can use, and I can send that to you, or we can talk through it at the next one, or one of the upcoming webinars, that people then usually get groups of participants around either a projected laptop, or they just do it on chart paper and then organize it into this template, and then circulate it so that other people can start to add into it, because you're maybe not always going to get everybody in that first meeting, or adding into it as you think about other interventions.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Ani said 3 and 4 would be great. So the early warning indicators and early warning systems, and selecting appropriate interventions. How about others? How about if you guys have any thoughts at all, you can email me. That's my email right there. If there's other aspects that you want. I might do a broader thinking about data one that would combine some of these. And then we can take it from there. That will get us through the next few, and then we can also add things along the way. Any questions?
Thank you, Jenny.
No problem.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop recording. If everyone will stay on for just a second. I do have a web address here that I just typed into the chat box. This is a survey for the webinar. So if you will take a minute and complete that, we need your feedback. So other than that, thank you for your time. Thank you, Jenny.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jenny.